back. And if you're joining us for the first time, then you are late and you've already missed one really fascinating discussion panel. But we have plenty more to come. And right now, we're going to be having a really discussion with three women who I know are going to give us a really realistic and honest view. So please welcome to this next conversation, Louise Ellison, Head of Sustainability at Hammerson, Philippa Gill, Director at Avora Global, and Patricia Brown, Director at Central. So again, we just have 30 minutes for conversation. We've got a lot to cover, so I'm going to jump straight in. So this horrible situation that we are now all in has, without a doubt, given the environment a little bit of a break, a breather, we could say. Air quality has got better, wildflowers are blooming, and excitedly for me, anyway, the goats have taken over Llandudno. But those wins, for want of a better word, have come at a cost to life and a cost to the economy. And we know from experience that the world and business, especially businesses under pressure, bounce back to business as usual very quickly. So unless we learn some lessons from this crisis and couple those lessons with the learnings from before, those positives that we might be recognizing today will be short-lived. So I'm going to start with the big question. And aside from the Welsh goats, what positives have we seen? And what are we learning from those that should help businesses create a better and economically viable future? I'm going to pose that question to you first, Louise.
Hello, everybody. It's great to be here. To start with, I think it's important to reflect on what you said. We are pretty conflicted about this. There are undoubtedly benefits, and as you put it, the planet has been given a little bit of a break in some respects, and we've seen huge changes in terms of air quality, which are amazing to see, and the speed at which we've seen those changes is really quite breathtaking in some instances. Some of those pictures from around the world in terms of changes in pollution levels. But of course, we're very conflicted about it because this is coming at a social and economic cost, which is completely beyond anything we would ever want to see and ever imagine. So how do we capture some of those things? But there are, beyond just those sort of simple environmental benefits and positives that we're seeing, there are a number of other areas which I think are quite interesting and things that we will be able to, and it's going to be important to capture. We've seen obviously a massive reduction in carbon emissions, but you can't transition to a different planet in terms of climate change by simply shutting down industry. That's not the way our future lies. But businesses have been able to transition very fast in terms of the way in which we work and communicate with each other. We're doing this right at this minute. The carbon emissions that would have come from us running the Sustainability Live event would have been not insignificant. It would be a city centre, obviously, physical event. These are dramatically reduced because of the way that we're now delivering this. And it's the same that everything that everybody's experiencing every day. We are communicating with our teams. So the idea that agile working is the future of business, I think it's going to be pretty strong. It's difficult for anybody really now to suggest that working in different places and using technology is going to slow productivity. I think a number of businesses are being surprised at how rapidly that's changed. So there are a number of great things, and that then opens up a lot of other opportunities in terms of communication and the way in which we operate across different businesses and globally. Hammerson as a business has international investors, obviously, and our investor relations team spend a lot of time flying around the place, talking to investors. That will undoubtedly change, and most other businesses are going to be doing the same thing. I think another change is going to be the fact that because everybody can see the change that can happen through individual actions and decisions, I think that will be captured, and we should be able to continue that message that it's the things that we as individuals do that can make an enormous difference. That's how, to a large extent, we've been tackling the crisis in terms of health. And that is a lot of what we can do around tackling climate change. It's the individual decisions that we make as people that can really resolve some of these things around climate change, and we're incredibly powerful, but we need to make those decisions. There was a report out on the different fashion retailers yesterday, and about those who are being most transparent. So there are clear individual decisions that we can make about who we purchase from, and those kinds of decisions, and it goes right the way through our economy. So there are some positives, I think, to take from this, and genuine positives that we can capture and maintain.
Fantastic. Thanks, Philippa. Would you agree with those positives? Are there any more that you've identified?
I mean, I think like all of us, I am my own thoughts on where we are in this and how we might come out change daily. And I think that's both on a very personal level, on an economic level, on a sustainability level. One of the things that actually had been kind of rattling around my mind before any of this hit is the realization that as a mammal, we have moved so far from how we evolved and the environment in which we evolved. But actually, this has been very at the front of my mind recently, because a lot of what we miss about being in the office, it's really funny. It was like, it's great, it's at home, I'm working in the garden, and 3 weeks later, everyone's like, get me back to the office now. Now, that might be because you're trying to homeschool while you're working. And my heart goes out to all of those of us who are doing that, because it's not easy. Or that might be because actually it turns out it's much more intense being on a video call for some reason all day than it is being in the office. Mm-hmm. So one of the things at Evora we're starting to think about is how do we reasonably take the positives and some of the negatives and turn that into something proactive, almost like a guideline, so that 2 weeks back into whatever the future looks like, we're mindful, and I use that word advisedly in every sense of the word, about what we did learn about ourselves, about what it means. I think the whole nature, and I don't disagree with people who say, the office is dead, it's not going to work anymore. Actually, the more and more people I talk to, is what they miss is the collaboration. Mm-hmm. They miss the creativity that comes from what we call the bump space, which might be the kettle, it might be what people used to call the water machine. It's passing in the corridor, it's overhearing what the team next to you is doing and generating energy from that. And from a health and well-being point of view, there's a lot of positive and negative, mental well-being things that I think we can positively bring out of this. So in a way, I'm looking forward to, and we're in the process of moving office, and it's really interesting how it's making me look at that in a different lens and think about, well, what does being next to people now mean? As Louise said, it's perfectly possible we could, on paper, continue doing this, forever, but I don't think anybody I spoke to wants to do that. So what is it about us and it's just made me more mindful of the fact that we are still the same mammals that we evolved hundreds of thousands of years ago. We still have the same needs. So maybe it's an opportunity to remind ourselves of actually what our fundamental needs are. And that's as much about the spaces that we occupy and how we manage them and how we deal with other people as it is about how we feel about going into whatever the office means when we can go back.
I certainly don't think we would want to continue to be working in isolation in any way, shape or form. But certainly the way in which, and the speed with which businesses have managed to transform, and the way in which we've are using the technology that's been at our fingertips for a long time, but we've never really pushed it, will enable us to change our thinking about how we do operate. And yes, people need to be together, and there are very good reasons for that. And I think that's thrown into sharp relief as much as the ability to work in a different way.
Pat, for you, in terms of those positives, anything extra that you're seeing there?
Yeah, certainly. Thanks, Sam. Great to be here and on Earth Day as well. Very appropriate. I think I'd like to take a step back and think about what we've changed over the past 20 odd years, including a lot of it driven by the real estate sector, in thinking about how we use public space anyway. And there has been a gradual appropriation of more space to pedestrians and cycling, but it's been really slow. So, in terms of thinking about the positives that you outlined earlier, Sam, People are really aware now of their environment and the positive environment that they're living in, even in this negative situation, and taking their joy from that. The fact that the air quality is absolutely so much better, and that happened within days, not weeks. The noise levels have gone down dramatically, both from car noise or vehicle noise and from aircraft noise. And then the sense of more open spaces for cycling and walking. I'll come back into that in a minute. And therefore, what people are very aware of is the physical environment improving. And one of the problems that we've had with behaviour change and carving out more space for us, people, over the past 20 odd years is we all think we want it, but we're not very good at giving things up. We've been made to give up things in a really harsh way now. It's a sort of a warp speed pace. We have had to stop doing the things that we once did. So in all of this, thinking about what the positives can be, is thinking how do we zero base where we are at the moment and build back up in layers so that we can open up the economy again, we can get back to working, but not as business as usual, but business as we want to define it, and come back with some sort of form of national conversation or local conversation or regional conversation about what good looks like in the future. Sam, this is something I've been working on again anyway, in terms of an initiative called London 3.0, about thinking what London needs to do next for its next set of challenges, including the climate emergency, but also including, and I think this is critical, is how we create an inclusive society in the next iteration. And I think that's become very important, and it has actually become, for me, it's a positive of this really negative situation, is people are now starting to realise that there are more haves and have-nots, and there is, a lot of people who've got a very significant space deficit, and living in single aspect homes without balconies and no outside space or gardens to call their own, and therefore having to think very differently about how we design our public space and our houses in the future, I think should be a positive. And being aware of the fact that it's not all people like us who are privileged people who can work from home, even if we are homeschooling. And that takes us to my last point, really, is how we use this opportunity, through initiatives like carving space out from cars. London has been rather slow in comparison to other cities to do that. New York has just passed a bill legislating 75 miles of roads to be given over to walking and cycling. We're completely on the back foot on that, even though there is new legislation coming through in England. So I guess my point really is, let's use this as an opportunity to think about what type of society we want to be when we come out of this, and build it incrementally.
I think that this situation has given us that opportunity to think about that, hasn't it? But as we've talked about, that has come at a cost, not just to life, but economically. And I just wonder how we make sure that when we do have to rebuild the economy, which we absolutely will have to, that we do it in the right way, that we take those positives and we can continue them. Are there methods and tools that we should be utilising, Louise, to make sure that we do that?
I don't know about methods and tools. I mean, there's a real need for very clear leadership, I think, and some real thinking about what it is that each of the sectors can contribute. And real estate is such a fundamental sector in terms of what it can deliver. We need to be very forward thinking as a sector in terms of putting out, how we think our sector can respond, and what we think real estate will look like, what contribution it will be able to make over the next 1, 2, 3, 5, 10, 15 and 50 years. We're around for a long time. So that investment in our infrastructure, all of those things need to really think about how we're going to create an economy that's incredible, that's much more positive, and that does incorporate all the things that Pat's been talking about in terms of reflecting society and reflecting social need. It's going to take us a while to do it, and I think there's going to be that balancing act between the need for some rapid economic refloating and regrowth that's going to have to happen over the second half of this year and into next year, and how we invest and how we make that happen, and to still balance that with that conversation about we need to make sure that this is about investment in clean tech. We need to make sure this is about investment in communication, connectivity, and really rebuilding some of the infrastructure, the social infrastructure that has been really kind of hollowed out, it feels like, over the last kind of 10 to 15 years. So I think I think tools and methods aren't going to be enough. There needs to be some wholesale rethinking about what it is that we can contribute as a sector, and we need to be quite specific about that and make quite a big noise about it.
Because it's going to be very easy, isn't it, to fall back on carbon intensive energy sources. I mean, oil is negative cost at the moment, and it would be so easy to just look for that easy route out of this, I suppose. Absolutely.
And politically, if you are wanting to refloat the economy fast, for the last 200 years, the way we always do it is by throwing cheap fossil fuels at that problem, and they will be around for us to be able to do that with. And you can see how that is going to be the easiest, kind of most rapid way of getting some of those industries kind of moving again and getting some employment back in again. But for the businesses who are around for longer than a political cycle, it is even more important for us to be able to say, hang on, there's got to be this is an opportunity to do this differently, because the risks we are facing, the climate change risks that we are facing, haven't gone away. We can see how quickly that we can make a difference, but that these things are very real. There are still people up and down the country who are out of the news now, who are having to deal with lockdown whilst having been flooded out of their homes. They're not on the headlines anymore, but they are having to deal with this on a daily basis. We feel we're in, as Pat said, we're in a fortunate position. All of us, the four of us, 5 of us sitting here, being able to work from home, we're pretty comfortable. We haven't been flooded out. If you've been flooded out, you don't have a home to work in. Those are the climate change issues that are very real for everybody, and they're not going anywhere. So, they're long-term issues for the whole investment community. There's a different level of risk. One of the things that I think this has thrown up, which is really interesting, is the way in which we deal with risk, because this sort of risk has, I think I heard of it being referred to as a grey rhinoceros risk as opposed to a black swan, because the grey rhinoceros is something that is around, but you don't necessarily expect to see it. So those risks haven't really been calculated for in the way that perhaps they should have been. So I think there will be a real kind of a real sort of review of the way in which businesses are looking at risks, and climate change will be part of that. Undoubtedly, it has to be.
Philippa, do you agree? Do you think that we're going to look at risk very differently coming out of this?
Well, interestingly, a lot of the work we're doing right now is helping people wrap their heads around what we're calling climate risk, and that includes a whole host of stuff such as net zero commitments. There's been some very meaningful net zero commitments globally as to whether, and that's not just across real estate. But putting a nice press release out with the best will in the world is very different, as we are discovering, to putting a wholesale business-wide approach to taking any kind of business, but particularly real estate with long hold assets, to net zero and what that means. And then there's regulation coming, and with my asset management investment head on, I think, Louise is completely right. The temptation will be just to switch everything back on and try to get back to what we called business as usual. But portfolios will not look the same coming out, and demand will not look the same coming out. And I don't think it's gone. It's going to be different in the same way that how our space is going to need to look to get people to want to come back into them. And now we've started to see that with kind of the health and wellbeing movement anyway. But as each asset manager kind of comes back and looks at the portfolio and sees what state it's in and what it looks like in terms of investment and long-term plans, I think it's a real challenge on a personal level and on a obviously corporate and investment and tenant level. It's a real challenge for everybody to look at it and go, okay, that model is just not fit for how we want it to be going forward. So how do we take that brave leap, given that a lot of these companies have made climate commitments in terms of net zero, and risk is starting to becoming, and Louise is completely right, the climate risk is stronger every day despite what we're living in now. So I think it will require leadership at every level to say we're not just going to flick everything back on. A lot of people were already looking at different ways of making that. So it's an opportunity, as always comes in a crisis, there is an opportunity to maybe take a leap for things that people were thinking about, such as renewables and obviously very low carbon energy sources, and a much more human approach, weaving in some of what Pat said. It is all about what kind of spaces do we design for humans, and this issue of, shouldn't everybody have the right to some green space? We're mammals. We evolved out in nature. How we ended up living in concrete jungles and thinking it's a good idea is beyond me. In the words of an 8-year-old, that's an epic fail on your project plan. Because that's not how we evolved, and yet we are the same animals. So I think there is a real opportunity there, but I think it will be for the brave to say we're going to seize that opportunity. It's going to be uncomfortable for a while, but actually coming out of this is going to be uncomfortable for a while anyway. So hopefully people will take the challenge.
I want to use this moment to put a question to you from our viewers, which we've touched on already, but they are straight to the point, so I'm going to go for it. So someone has asked in Slido whether sustainability initiatives are going to drop to the bottom of the priority list post COVID-19, and if they do, how do we ensure that it's not forgotten as we try to rebuild profit?
I think it's unlikely, but there's going to be obviously business pressures, and different businesses will deal with this in different ways. It's quite interesting. We at the Better Buildings Partnership, we did a quick kind of survey of the members to ask them kind of what their initial kind of responses on a number of different things were, but one of which was the whether or not they felt their sustainability agenda was going to be reduced or dialed back or challenged in some way. None of them came back and said that the businesses were going to be sort of thinking differently or reduce their commitment to sustainability. Admittedly, it's a relatively self-selecting group of people, because these are all businesses that are members of the Better Buildings Partnership. But there certainly isn't a loss of or lack of interest and appetite for it. And I think in many ways, because of some of the challenges that we are facing and will continue to face, those businesses that have dealt with this are already looking at sustainability and have a kind of fairly comprehensive plan will be those that are more resilient to being able to come out of this in a positive way. The other side of it is the investor community, because certainly for a listed company like Hammerson, the investor, sustainability is part of our corporate proposition. That's not going to go away, and the investor community that we speak to, they, and particularly over the last 6 to 9 months, the mainstream investors as well, their appetite for this is incredibly strong. They have recognised the level of risk that is attached to carbon and climate change. That's not going anywhere. So it won't be pushed to the bottom of the agenda. There will be a lot of revision of business plans across businesses and across sectors, but I very much doubt whether sustainability is going to become something that is carved out, unless you are a business that is only seeing this as greenwash and as PR. And if that's the case, well, you've got a bigger problem, I think.
I think that for me is a wonderful positive to take from this, that sustainability won't be pushed down the agenda, because the pessimistic journalist in me would say, well, of course it will. So I'm really encouraged to hear that. And so time is never on our side. Of course, we've got about 5 minutes left of this conversation. So I'd love to get from each of you the positive takeaway for you that we absolutely must take forward, that we must learn from as we come out of this situation. Pat, I'm going to start with you.
Okay, I want to go back to the last two questions and boil them to get knit them all together. I think that picking up on Louise's point about the importance of leadership and thinking about the sustainability, British Property Federation do have their rethinking real estate program, and I know that that is really focusing on the future of a sustainable real estate sector as well. And they are continuing to look at that and thinking, how do the real estate team work closely with government in making sure that that we come out of this both sustainably in terms of our lifestyles and sustainably in terms of our economy and our businesses. So I think we have to look at what we are gaining now and try and fix that in our imagination and overlay that sort of sense of the positives with the right type of leadership at different levels. Louise also talked about the social infrastructure that we've lost. How do we then bring back the social infrastructure in order to ensure that we can continue to have the conversations and critically iterate, because that's something we're not very good at. We fix ourselves on a path and we continue down that path regardless of what is happening. So iterative leadership, which is inclusive, is the future for me.
Fantastic. Thank you. Philippa?
It's hard to wrap it all up. I think fortune favours the brave, to reuse an old hashtag. We talked about blunt and honest. So here's blunt and honest. There's always been a part of the market that does the minimum requirements. It's interesting that, and at the other end, there's not only the thought leaders, but the do leaders as well. And I think it will be incumbent on them. And I fully expect that they will seize the opportunity and show leadership, because that's the kind of line that they're on. But I think the most important thing for me is to have a moment of reflection before, I see it as a kind of a panel of switches that have all been turned off. Before you flick all the switches back on, is just to have a pause and a quiet moment amid what will be a kind of urgency of panic, particularly on whether it's your own life or an investment trust. Even an investment trust, each decision is made by a person and then a group of people and then a corporate group. Is before flicking it all back on, to take the opportunity to say, is it right to just flick this back on, and can I do it a better way?
Fantastic. Thank you. Louise?
There are a number of things that you can take away from this. I think probably the one I would highlight here, though, is the power of the individual, because we've seen that so clearly in a number of ways over the last few weeks, both in terms of the power of the individual to kind of help stop the spread of the virus, the power of the individual in terms of helping each other, what we are wanting to do around volunteering. So we have for a long time known that it's individual decisions that can really make a difference in terms of climate change. And I think really capturing that and getting people to acknowledge, understand, and remember that it is in our hands to be able to make these changes. And we are powerful when we move collectively. I think that's a really important message for us to remember.
I think that's great. The power of the individual and taking time to reflect and making sure that we've got those great leaders in place. This is such a huge conversation to have and to squeeze into 30 minutes. There's so much that we've already learned and so much more I think and I hope for us to learn still. But for right now, that has to come to an end, and we have to take our little moment of reflection before we come back for our next session at 1:10 we will be reflecting on the future, of course, in our final session at 2:15. But for now, please, everyone listening, join me in thanking our panelists today, Louise, Philippa and Patricia. Thank you so much for joining us.
You're very welcome.
Thank you, everyone.
Sam. Thanks,
Excellent.
everybody. Bye.
See everyone at 1:10 for Everything Needs Diversity, Ensuring Social and Economic Robustness. And if someone can bring me a cup of tea, I would be most grateful. So I will
on its way.
On its way. See you all then.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.